Welcome back to the deep dive. You brought us a really challenging and fascinating stack of historical sources this time. We're not just looking at the usual suspects, battles, philosophy, but digging right into the engine room of ancient societies, law, power, and this huge shift in where legal authority actually came from.
That's exactly right. And our
Yeah.
mission today really is to weave together these historical threads, these documents, to trace something absolutely fundamental to Western civilization. We're looking at how justice systems evolved, moving, from these older, often messy, religious, clan-based ways of doing
Right.
things.
Community justice, blood feuds, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Towards these much more complex, written down, codified, and crucially centralized legal structures, we're focusing particularly on Athens and then on Rome.
And when you dig into this history, the core question seems to be how the individual's place in the law changed. I mean, whether you were a citizen, someone in debt, or accused of a crime, your whole relationship with the law was turned upside down when the ultimate source wasn't, divine signs or family tradition anymore.
But human-made institutions, an assembly making laws, or later, an emperor issuing an edict. That's the big shift.
It's an incredible contrast, isn't it? You've got Athens with its super participatory
It's
democracy.
almost chaotic sometimes.
Yeah. And then you have Rome, this vast, sprawling, bureaucratic legal machine.
Yeah.
So we'll navigate this by pulling out these foundational legal ideas from the sources, hunting for those key nuggets that really underpin how we think about rights and responsibilities even today.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this shift in Athens. Draco, 7th century BC. His name always means harshness, right? Draconian laws.
Mm.
But ironically, his biggest legal innovation, the one we're focusing on, was actually a step towards something more individualized, more sophisticated, especially around homicide. What was the world like before his law? It was a world defined by the collective, fundamentally. Before Draco's homicide law, around 621 BC, justice, if you can call it that, was governed by collective responsibility, vicarious liability. If one person in your clan, your genos, committed a serious crime, the entire family structure, sometimes the whole community, was considered polluted, responsible. It led to these endless cycles of revenge, blood feuds.
And to really grasp how heavy that collective burden was, we need to look at cases like the Alcmeonid curse. It almost sounds like myth, but it had real legal teeth, didn't it?
Oh, terrifyingly real legal and political consequences. The actions of just a few people, Megacles and his group, executing conspirators in a sacred place meant the whole Alcmeonid family, the Genos, was condemned. The source material highlights that this pollution, this miasma, affected everyone living, their descendants, even their ancestors. The legal action wasn't just punishment, it was about removing the spiritual stain that was seen as threatening the whole city, the polis. Vicarious liability meant your legal status could be determined by something your great-grandfather did. You were born into it.
So Draco comes along and challenges this ancient way of thinking, at least for killing. He narrows down who's actually on the hook. How did he manage that? It sounds revolutionary.
He did it with legal precision. That was the key. Draco's law specifically limited responsibility for homicide to the person who physically did the killing or plotted it. The phrase was, the person who kills with his own hand or conspires to kill, ton autovsturk tevnantia bolivsanta. The genius is in that specificity.
The moment you isolate the actor Ottoffer by his own hand, you basically let the rest of the family off the hook, legally speaking. This is kind of the birth certificate of the legal individual in the West, isn't it?
It really is, in a profound way. By defining agency so narrowly, who actually did it, who planned it, Draco establishes the principle of individual liability. And this wasn't just a minor tweak, it became a defining feature of Athenian law right through the classical period. It legally separated the person from their tribe or family for the most serious crime imaginable. Your relatives were only liable if they actively plotted the crime, Lenam Santa, so the burden shifted from just being related, from passive lineage to active involvement.
And the strength of this idea is shown by the fact it actually stuck around, even with all the political chaos that followed Draco.
Exactly. Look at Solon, the great reformer, about a generation later, 594 BC. He came in and basically repealed almost all of Draco's other famously harsh laws. But, and this is crucial, he deliberately kept the homicide laws. Solon retained Draco's standard of individual liability. That tells you it worked, at least in the short term, and that Athenian society basically accepted this new standard of accountability. They might have thought the rest of Draco's stuff was too much, but this specific change, they saw the value in punishing the actual perpetrator.
But even with this move towards secular law, individual responsibility, Athens never completely cut ties with the divine, did it? Justice always seems to have this blend of the worldly and the sacred.
That's a constant theme, yes. While Draco's initial focus seems pretty secular, stop the blood feuds, establish order by the 5th century, religious elements are fully woven back in. You see the doctrine of miasma, pollution becoming really important, this idea that an unpunished killer literally contaminates the community.
So it wasn't just about the victim's family wanting revenge anymore.
No, it was much bigger. This pollution wasn't just, feeling guilty. It was seen as a physical contaminant that could affect the whole city, cause famine, plague, military defeat. An unpunished killer was an existential threat to the polis itself.
Wow. So what did that mean in practice? How did this religious concern actually play out in the legal system?
Well, it meant purification rituals were essential. Avoidance of the killer was crucial. The victim's family, the philoi, had a religious duty, a requirement of piety, to pursue the killer. It wasn't just for vengeance, it was about cleansing the community. And this complexity shows up in their court system, too. They realize not all killings are the same.
Right, they had different courts for different types of homicide. It wasn't just one big courthouse.
Exactly. It's quite remarkable. The Areopagus court dealt with intentional murder. The Delphinian handled cases of justifiable homicide. Maybe someone admitted the killing but argued it was lawful. Then you had the Palladian for involuntary homicide, like accidental killings. The Friato was for exiled individuals who killed again while in exile, a really specific situation. And even the Prytanean, which handled killings by animals or inanimate objects. This whole intricate setup shows a really sophisticated legal approach, trying to satisfy both the secular need for order and the sacred need for ritual purity.
Okay, so let's try and connect this focus on the individual, even with the religious overlay, to the bigger picture of Athenian democracy. How did law actually function in a system built around citizens participating directly?
Well, after Cleisthenes' reforms, the democracy really took hold, defined by this profound democratical spirit. Now, there's a bit of a debate among historians about how much of Solon's original law code actually survived. Cicero thought Solon's laws were still fundamental, but others, like the historian Grote, really emphasized the radical changes that came later. So there was this constant tension between the written law and how things were actually practiced.
And we get that fantastic anecdote from the sources about that tension, the poet Crinidas complaining about people disrespecting the actual law tablets.
Yes, Cratinus apparently grumbled that people were using the wooden tablets inscribed with the laws of Solon and Draco to roast their barley. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the laws were totally ignored, but it captures this certain casualness, perhaps, towards the written code itself compared to the living, breathing practice of democracy in the assembly and the courts. The democracy itself, the people debating and deciding, was seen as the ultimate source of law, maybe more than the dusty old tablets.
And the mechanism that really defined that democratic spirit in action was the use of the lot, wasn't it? Random selection. Why put so much faith in chance?
The lot was seen as the purest expression of democratic equality, and it really took off after Cleisthenes, choosing archons, other magistrates, and especially distributing the jurors, the dicasts, into panels for trials, all done by lot. This wasn't just administrative convenience, it was a powerful political statement. Using chance was meant to counteract the influence of wealth, family name, connections. It aimed to ensure that a broad slice of ordinary citizens administered the laws, reflecting the will of the demos, the people, rather than the ambitions of the elite few.
So the whole democratic system, with its citizen juries and randomly picked officials, was kind of designed to manage human nature, wasn't it? Especially self-interest.
Absolutely. The Athenians were incredibly aware of the tug of self-interest on individuals, as one source puts it. They weren't naive. The genius, perhaps, of their democracy was that it didn't try to stamp out self-interest. They knew that was impossible. Instead, they designed legal and constitutional tools, like the lot, and also the liturgies we'll get to channel that private drive towards the common good. The constant hum of judicial activity was in part a way of balancing that civic duty against private gain.
And this tension, this pull between private life and the demands of the city, you really see it in how the democratic polis was physically and politically put together. Cleisthenes' reforms weren't just about courts. They were like social engineering, weren't they? Aiming for unity.
Oh, completely. Cleisthenes' overhaul around 508 BC was brilliant political design. He deliberately set out to break down old local loyalties. He created 10 new tribes, but the key was how he constructed them. Each tribe was deliberately made up of demes, these local districts, drawn from 3 totally different geographical zones. The estuve, the city itself, the Paravalia, the coast, and the Mesogaia, the inland farming areas.
Right, so you couldn't just have, say, the coastal merchants forming their own power block. They were mixed in with city dwellers and farmers in the same political tribe. That must have forced cooperation or at least diluted conflict.
Exactly. It forced people to think beyond their immediate locality or economic interests. It created a wider political affiliation. And this newly mixed citizen body was the foundation for the main legislative body, the Assembly. In the Assembly, the principle was radical equality. One citizen, one vote. And that famous phrase they used to start debates, who wishes to speak? Tis agori win bulatai. That wasn't just politeness, it was a legal guarantee. Every citizen, rich or poor, famous or unknown, had the right to stand up and address the people.
But an assembly of thousands needs some kind of organization, right? How did they balance that raw power of every citizen having a say with the need to actually get things done, the executive function?
They had the Council 500, the Bulo. These were citizens over 30, again chosen by lot, serving for just 1 year, and you couldn't serve consecutive terms usually. The council's main job was essentially executive and preparatory. It set the agenda for the assembly, drafted preliminary proposals, probolumata for debate, so it provided structure, administrative oversight, and acted as a check, ensuring officials were accountable at the end of their term through the euthana, the review process.
And funding all this, the assembly, the council, the courts, the navy, wasn't through income tax like we think of it. It was this system of liturgies.
Yeah.
Basically, compelled public service funded by the rich.
That's it, exactly. The liturgy system was this really clever, if burdensome, way to tap private wealth for public good, and also a form of political control. Wealthy Athenian men were legally required to fund major public services. The famous examples are the choresia, paying for a chorus in a play or festival, which was a huge honor but expensive, and the really big one, the trierarchy.
That was commanding and funding a warship, right? A trireme.
Yes, commanding it, maintaining it, often paying for a chunk of the upkeep and crew costs for a whole year, hugely expensive and demanding.
Forcing people to spend vast sums of their own money sounds like it would create legal friction. Were there rules to stop it getting out of hand?
Absolutely. Because it was so compulsory and so costly, they needed rules. Legally, a man wasn't supposed to be hit with more than one major ordinary liturgy in a single year. And the trierarchy, because it was just so incredibly burdensome, eventually got its own specific legal protection, a 2-year exemption after you completed one. The law had to recognize the sheer drain on private resources.
You can almost feel the political arguments behind those rules. Demosthenes complaining about some guys doing multiple trierarchies while others did nothing.
It shows that constant negotiation, that legal balancing act. The democracy needed the wealthy to fund its defense. The Navy was everything, but the law also had to stop the system being abused. Maybe rivals trying to bankrupt each other through excessive liturgy assignments. It had to set some limits on civic duty to keep it sustainable.
And what about military service itself? The hoplite soldier was the backbone. How did the law enforce accountability on the actual battlefield?
Military service was just fundamental to being a citizen. But the legal view on, say, running away in battle was maybe more nuanced than we'd think. Retreat wasn't automatically cowardice in the eyes of the law. Entire hoplite lines got routed, sometimes think Stelium, Amphipolis, Chaeronea. The law seemed more focused on individual actions and responsibilities, especially for officers.
How could they even track individual behavior in the middle of a chaotic battle?
Well, the sources suggest that officers and wealthier hoplites generally often went for very distinctive, high-quality, expensive armor. Partly for status, sure, but it had this unintended legal consequence. It made them easily identifiable. If an officer in fancy bronze armor was clearly seen fleeing or failing in his duty, that distinctive gear basically served as evidence for potential legal action afterwards. High status meant high visibility and potentially higher legal accountability. Wealth didn't get you a pass, it made you easier to watch.
Okay, shifting from the grand structures to everyday law and order. Did every accusation in Athens lead to a big jury trial by lot, or were there quicker methods? Summary justice.
For certain types of common criminals, yes, there was a process called apagoge, literally dragging away. This allowed any citizen to arrest certain illicit offenders, typically thieves, highwaymen, kidnappers, maybe escaped slaves if they caught them epilautophoroi. That means in the very act, red-handed.
And what happened then? Did they just execute them on the spot?
It depended. Speed was key. If the person caught red-handed was brought before a magistrate and admitted their guilt right there and then, yes, prompt execution could follow. This reflects that community sense that some crimes are just obvious, self-evident, and need immediate resolution. However, If the accused denied guilt, even if caught red-handed, a proper trial was legally required. So there was still a safeguard against arbitrary execution, even for seemingly obvious criminals. But this kind of swift justice for common crime stands in stark contrast to how the formal courts were often used, especially in times of political turmoil. The case of Ageratus after the Peloponnesian War is a classic example of courts becoming political weapons.
Right. Ageratus was accused after democracy was restored. His crime was basically informing on democratic leaders to the previous oligarchic regime, the 30 tyrants. So the trial was payback, essentially.
Exactly. The prosecution basically argued by ratting out these democratic generals and officers, Ageratus helped the oligarchs take over, therefore he's an enemy of the democracy. It shows this deep tension. The same court system, designed with the lot for impartiality, could be turned into a tool to cement the power of the current regime, punish opponents, and reward benefactors of the winning side. It's fascinating that Ageratus had apparently been cleared and even honored by the previous oligarchic government.
Okay, so let's make the shift now. We're moving from Athens, vibrant, participatory, maybe a bit chaotic, to Rome, a civilization that really built its empire and its legal legacy on structure, procedure, and eventually massive centralization. Even back in the Republic, Roman law seems to have rested on these two key pillars, almost in tension with each other, the ibligus civil and the ibligus honorarium.
That duality is absolutely central to understanding how Roman law grew and adapted. The Aemius Civil, the civil law, was the old, formal, quite rigid body of law. It came largely from the 12 Tables and applied strictly to Roman citizens. It was very formalistic, sometimes quite archaic, and often struggled to keep up with, say, new business practices or changing ideas of fairness. But then you had the Aemius Honorarium.
The law developed by the magistrates, especially the praetor, like an equity system?
Precisely. The Aemius Honorarium was effectively the law of equity, and the praetor was the main engine driving it. He was the magistrate responsible for administering justice. But how did he adapt the law without actually rewriting the statutes? The Aemius Civil. That's the clever part.
Procedure, right? His edict.
Exactly. Every year, when a praetor took office, he issued his edict, the edictum. This was a public declaration setting out how he planned to carry out his duties. Crucially, it listed the legal claims he would allow, the defenses he would recognize, and the remedies, the specific legal actions or actions he would grant or refuse during his year in office. He couldn't change the substance of the edictus civil. Only laws passed by the assemblies could do that. But by controlling the procedure, by granting or withholding remedies, he could effectively shape the outcome.
So if the strictus civil said, maybe this contract is technically valid, but the praetor thought it was achieved through fraud,
he couldn't just say, the contract is void. But he could announce in his edict that he would grant a defense based on fraud, exceptio doli, to the person being sued. Or he could refuse to grant the plaintiff the legal action needed to enforce the contract in the first place. The Aemius Civil still existed on paper, but the praetor's procedural tools, his Appennis Honorarium, effectively modified how it worked in practice. It stood, as the sources say, side by side with the civil law, adapting it, making it more flexible. It's very similar to how equity courts developed much later in England to soften the edges of the common law.
and you see that Roman focus on formality, on binding obligation, even in the really early legal concepts like the word for contract.
Absolutely. Look at nexum. This was an early Republican term for a contract, particularly one involving debt. It literally meant a strong bond, or even more vividly, a chain linking the parties. One source really emphasizes how this physical metaphor, the chain of obligation, stuck around and continued to influence how Romans thought about contract law right through the empire. It shows how deeply rooted their law was in these almost physical, ritualistic ideas of binding duty and formality.
But that Republican system, with its assemblies and elected magistrates like the praetor, eventually gave way to something much more centralized, especially once Augustus establishes the Principate around 27 BC. This brought huge changes to criminal justice.
This is where we see the rise of the cognitio extraordinaria, the extraordinary procedure. This was a fundamental shift. It moved criminal trials away from the jury courts, the questiones perpetuae or ordo ediciorum publicorum, which had defined the Republic. Instead, trials increasingly came under the direct control of magistrates acting as delegates of the emperor, or even the emperor himself. The whole point was to, as one scholar puts it, liberate criminal justice from the rigid procedures and potential unpredictability of the old jury system.
And what was the key difference in how these cognitio trials worked? What made them extraordinary?
The single biggest difference was discretion. Under the cognatio system, the judge, the cognator, who was often an imperial official, had enormous freedom. They had discretion in defining what even counted as a crime. Acts that weren't covered by existing statutes could be brought to trial. And crucially, they had huge discretion in sentencing. Punishments could be made much harsher or much lighter, based entirely on the judge's assessment of the case, the accused's status, or even orders from higher-ups, ultimately from the emperor.
And this discretion almost immediately led to punishments reflecting social class, didn't it?
It did, starkly. The distinction between the upper classes, the honestiores, and the lower classes, the humiliores, became legally formalized in punishment. For the same crime, an honestior might face exile or a fine, while a humilior could face death, often by brutal means like crucifixion or condemnation to the mines or gladiatorial games. The old Republican ideal of, at least theoretical, equality before the law eroded rapidly under this discretionary system, even if the names of the crimes often stayed the same.
How did this new centralized justice work out in the provinces, especially when dealing with non-citizens, the peregrini?
Provincial governors held immense power under the empire. For non-capital cases involving non-citizens, they often just relied on local laws and customs, or, frankly, their own administrative judgment, their ingenuity, as one source puts it. For capital cases, Augustus allowed governors the option of using juries, mimicking the old Roman system, but it wasn't required. The governor could convene a jury, concilium, or he could just decide the case entirely by himself using the cognitio procedure. That power to decide alone gave Roman governors almost absolute judicial authority over vast populations.
Before we get to the emperor as the ultimate source of law, let's look at how the Romans thought about civil wrongs, personal injury. The idea of inuria seems to have changed quite a bit over time.
Yes, it did. In early Roman law, inuria basically just meant any act contrary to law, any wrong. But by the classical period, it took on a much more specific and I think quite sophisticated meaning. Its core became contumelia. This is a difficult word to translate perfectly, but it means something like insult, outrage, an affront to someone's dignity, their self-respect, their reputation. It was about an overweening self-assertion by one person at another's expense.
So Roman law actually protected people from being insulted, from having their honor attacked, not just from physical harm.
Absolutely. The scope of inuria based on contumelia was broad. It covered intentional physical assaults, yes, but also things like public slander, defamation, shouting abuse in the street, even things that invaded someone's privacy or honor in more subtle ways. The key was the insult. And fascinatingly, this meant that even writing an abusive letter that only the victim saw could still count as inuria. It didn't require publication to a third party, unlike some modern defamation laws. It shows a really advanced legal protection for personal honor and self-worth.
Okay, so the trajectory is clear. Centralization. And the ultimate endpoint of that is the emperor himself becoming the source of law. That famous phrase from the jurist Ulpian, Quod principi placut, legis habet vigorum. What pleases the emperor has the force of law.
That doctrine really is the summit of centralized legal authority in the Roman world. It meant that anything the emperor decided, his decrees, decreta, his edicts, edicta, his written replies to queries, rescripta, all carried the full weight of a statute passed by the old assemblies. What's really interesting, though, is how they justified this legally. It wasn't presented, at least initially, as just raw power grab. There was a legal theory behind it.
The fiction of the transfer, right? The lex regia, the idea that the Roman people themselves had handed over their power.
Precisely. The legal theory, the sort of constitutional fiction, was that through a supposed law, the lex de imperio, or sometimes called lex regia, the Roman people had formally conferred all their power, imperium, and authority, potestas, onto the emperor. Now, whether such a law ever actually happened in a meaningful way is debatable, but the idea was crucial. It provided the legal justification, linking the emperor's absolute power back, however tenuously, to the theoretical sovereignty of the Roman people, even if that sovereignty was now effectively permanently delegated.
And this concentration of power in the emperor completely changed the role of all the old Republican magistrates, didn't it? They weren't really independent players anymore.
Not at all. Under the old Senate-dominated system, magistrates were already becoming more like executive commissioners carrying out the Senate's will. Under the empire, this intensified. Real power shifted to appointed officials who answered directly to the emperor. Figures like the Praetorian prefect, initially the emperor's bodyguard commander, gained immense judicial and administrative power. The urban prefect controlled the city of Rome. These appointed bureaucrats, not elected magistrates, became the key figures running the machinery of justice, illustrating that shift from a more consensus-based system to a hierarchical, top-down command structure.
But while the source of law became centralized in the emperor, the empire itself kept growing, incorporating more and more people.
Hmm.
And this led to its own kind of complexity, didn't it? Legal pluralism as Roman citizenship spread.
Yes, and this process started much earlier than the empire, actually. Rome made a really radical break with the old city-state model way back in 338 BC. That's when they granted full Roman citizenship to several Latin cities, like Lanuvium. This was shocking at the time because, as Cicero later pointed out, the traditional view was that you couldn't hold citizenship in two states simultaneously. Roman citizenship was seen as exclusive.
So how did that work? How could you be a Roman citizen but still belong to Lanuvium with its own local identity and maybe laws?
It forced a new way of thinking. Because, as the legal historian Maine observed, ancient societies didn't primarily base political rights on just living in the same place. That idea was utterly strange and monstrous to primitive antiquity. Early legal and political groups were built around fictions of common ancestry, shared religious rights, kinship. Granting Roman citizenship en masse to other communities forced the Romans to accept that people could have multiple layers of legal identity. You were Roman, yes, but you also had your local identity. This inevitably led to legal pluralism, different laws applying to different groups within the same empire, and marked the decline of the old homogeneous city-state ideal.
And finally, we have to touch on the absolute foundation of Roman society and law. The family, the household, ruled by the paterfamilias.
The patriarchal household is fundamental. Early Roman law viewed the eldest living male ancestor, the paterfamilias, as having almost absolute authority, patria potestas, over his descendants. This power, in its earliest, harshest form, theoretically extended even to life and death over his children, regardless of their age. The sources make it clear. Early law was deeply rooted in this family structure, where the male head was the source of all domestic authority and, crucially, property rights.
Right, because even adult sons couldn't legally own property independently while their father was alive.
Exactly. Legally, anything a son acquired belonged to the paterfamilias. The key difference between a son under power and a slave wasn't about owning property now, but about the son's potential to eventually become a paterfamilias himself upon his father's death and inherit that authority. But even this incredibly rigid structure began to soften over time, especially under the influence of imperial lawmaking.
This is where things like fideicomissa come in, these trusts or legacies. They seem to require moving beyond strict rules to figuring out what someone actually intended.
Yes, fideicomissa were a major development. They were essentially requests, often made in a will, asking an heir to pass on property to someone else who couldn't legally inherit directly under the strict aequus civil. Dealing with these required the courts, often under the emperor's jurisdiction, to look beyond the formal words and try to determine the testator's true intent, his voluntas, and apply principles of equity, equitas. The Digest, for example, has cases about interpreting a testator's wishes regarding which freedmen had properly maintained an estate. It's all about intention and fairness, not just rigid rules.
And even with something as absolute as slavery, imperial decisions could introduce nuance, couldn't they?
Yes, even the act of freeing a slave, manumission, could be complex. It might be conditional, requiring the freed slave to perform certain duties or swear an oath. There's a fascinating case mentioned in the Digest where a slave was granted freedom in a will in two different ways, a direct grant and also through a fideicomissum. A rescript from the Emperor Marcus Aurelius actually ruled that the slave could choose which legal path to freedom they preferred. It shows the emperor's centralized, discretionary power being used sometimes to inject flexibility and even a degree of choice into areas where the old formal law was completely rigid. Hashtag tag out of check outro.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has taken us across centuries. We've seen the path from that revolutionary moment in Athens where Draco singles out the individual killer, breaking the collective curse, all the way to the Roman emperor embodying the law itself.
It's an incredible trajectory. And these two ancient systems, Athens and Rome, they really did lay down the blueprint for so much of modern Western law. You see the Athenian ideal of civic participation shaping political justice, and then the Roman genius for developing universal, adaptable legal principles, first through the praetor's equity, then through the emperor's centralized decrees. They gave us the raw materials for our distinctions between criminal and civil law, the ongoing tension between statute law and equity.
What really stands out is seeing law itself transform from something tied to local custom, family power, maybe signs from the gods, to becoming this deliberate, written, enforceable product of human institutions, human rulers, professional lawyers. It's like this story of reason gradually taking over from tradition.
Which does leave us with a pretty provocative final thought, doesn't it? Today, we rely on our modern sovereign, whether it's a parliament, a constitution, the people to give our laws legitimacy. But when we look back at that Roman imperial maxim, quod principi placuit leges habet vigorem, what pleases the emperor is law. Is the nature of sovereign power today fundamentally different? Or have we just developed more formalized, more institutionalized ways to legitimize and wield what is ultimately a very similar kind of absolute legal authority?
That is definitely something to think about. Who or what truly holds the authority behind our laws today? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the very foundations of justice. We'll see you next time.